I'm Father Bob Miller from the Episcopal Parish of Ames, and we are privileged tonight to have two distinguished guests to speak about the prophetic voice of women in religion today. You know, much of what we are told that it comes with a great deal of authority. Our parents and our grandparents, at least our spiritual parents and grandparents, often say to us, well, that's the way it's always been. And sometimes they will tell you, well, that's the way God ordained it. That's God's will. And fortunately, from time to time, God calls up prophets among us to speak what is His will. And at times, what we are told is God's will and what is actually God's will are two different things. So fortunately for us, we have with us two prophets in religion tonight. And it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce a very good and dear friend, Katrina Swanson.
Thank you, Bob. Thank all of you for inviting me to be with you this evening. It's indeed an honor to be here with you in Ames and for us to be working on some of these issues together. Can everybody hear me? Great. We're here tonight to talk about the changing role of women in religion. And especially, I was asked to speak about the concept of authority as far as women have been involved in religion and in things spiritual. And what has been happening through the centuries has been illustrated among other places in Scripture. And I think that words, and especially in Scripture, words are very important. There are 6 words that have been used, translated to the word authority in English, that come out of 6 different Hebrew or Greek words that I will be dealing with tonight. And it's interesting, I'm just taking these 6 words because they are texts that have to do with the authority of women down through the time. The first story I want to tell you is the story of Esther, because one of those authority words was used to talk about Esther. The story starts out after the Emperor Xerxes had been having a 7-day drink-em-up party with his buddies. And he invited his queen, whose name was Vashti, to come and meet his friends. In fact, the scriptures say that he was kind of feeling no pain, only they used different words than that. And Vashti said, thank you very much, but no thank you. And so the emperor didn't quite know how to respond to that kind of a response. I guess he wasn't used to anybody sort of not accepting his invitations, especially his wife. And so he spoke with his advisors, and I don't imagine that any of his advisors were women. And his advisors said, we think you ought to get rid of her, because if the other women in the empire hear about this, then we're all in trouble, because the other women are going to start not doing what we ask them to do too. And so Xerxes did get rid of Vashti. And then he began to get a little bit lonely. So everybody said, well, now it's time for you to get a new person to keep you company. And so Xerxes kind of had his own private Playboy club. And he had a tryout for people to come and decide which one he was going to pick. And this contest was such that it took each of the contestants a whole year to get her act together to perform for this one night, or to be available for this one night. Well, comes on the scene a very, very lovely woman whose name was Esther. And she must have really had a very special personality, because the people who helped to prepare the women for this contest really took a liking to her, and sure enough, you can guess this next part of the story is that Xerxes decides that Esther is the lady for him. And so she becomes Queen Esther. And everything goes along fine for a while. In fact, Esther has a marvelous uncle named Mordecai, who's been her guardian down through the ages. And Mordecai finds out that some folks are going to assassinate Xerxes, and he blows the whistle. In a way, is a bit of a hero because he has saved Xerxes' life. But there's so often a villain in these stories, and the villain's name was Haman. And Haman became the prime minister of this thing. And unfortunately, Haman just kind of had a big swelled head, which got bigger and bigger and bigger. And somewhere along the line, the emperor decides that it would be a neat idea. I think probably Haman decided this, but the emperor did something about it. If everybody bowed down to Haman, and so Haman could feel even more important. And Mordecai, Esther's uncle, felt that he really couldn't bow down to a human, and that Haman wasn't God, so he didn't bow down to him. And so eventually the story got around that the reason Mordecai was not bowing down was because he was a Jew. And so Haman decided to get even with Mordecai by getting the king to issue a decree saying that all Jews would have to be killed on a certain day. And Mordecai was pretty upset, and Esther found out about it. And it's really beautiful to see their relationship there. She really cared, and so they got together. And Mordecai said, we're all in this together. Something's got to be done. And Esther says, well, ordinarily you're not supposed to go see my husband, even me, unless he invites you to come in, but we'll figure out a way. So sure enough, and I think probably God had something to do with this, the king happened to notice Esther walking by his quarters and invited her to come and talk to him. And she, forgot the most important part of the story. She said to Mordecai, before she did this, she said, I'm going to fast and pray for 3 days. Please get everybody else in the capital city to join me in this fasting and prayer. And I do think that is the most important part of the story. And so everybody joined together, all the Jews in Susa and Esther, fasting and praying that she would be able to talk to Xerxes about this. Well, I'm not going to tell you all the rest of the details, but Esther does manage to turn things around, and Haman ends up just getting such a big swelled head that he ends up getting hung on his own gallows that he had put up to see Mordecai hung on. And then eventually Mordecai and Esther and King Xerxes figure out a way that Xerxes, needless to say, could save face, because there's always that aspect in things that involve authority, so that the Jews were not killed and that they were saved. And then it was decided that a holiday should be declared to celebrate this. And that's where Esther's authority comes in, because the one of the two places in the Hebrew scriptures that are not in the Apocrypha where the word authority is used, because the Hebrew scriptures don't seem to use authority because it's not a concrete enough concept, is when this letter is being sent out to begin the festival, to celebrate the deliverance from this horrible persecution. And Esther puts all of her full authority behind the letter to institute the festival of Purim, to celebrate this festival. The word for authority in that story is the word tokef, which means positiveness. And I think so often when we're thinking about authority, we don't necessarily think of it in terms of positiveness. And so I think it's very touching to realize that this first example in scriptures had something to do with a woman. Now, I think it's kind of interesting to look at this story of a woman's fall from authority, Vashti, or prominence, because the leading men feared her influence over other women. And I'd like to tell just a quick little story, and I hope I'm not going on too long about all of this. When I was first married, I was a clergy wife. I was not ordained then. And my husband had an old football-playing friend named Warren Debenham, who was a priest in the Diocese of California. And his wife and I were good friends. And I was the kind of clergy wife that said that I wanted to be independent, and I didn't really like being a clergy wife and one thing and another. And I can remember Warren saying to George, "Don't you let Katrina spend much time with my wife because I don't want her to get that way." So we know what Vashti was up against. Anyway, it is a dynamic that goes on. And so it was interesting that because she refused to take part in what might have been unseemly proceedings, she was banished from her position of authority and prominence. Probably no women were part of that advisory group. But then I think it's really interesting to note the changing role of women in that short little story. And that's why I was sorry that I left out that important part of the story, because I think it was because of religion that that change took place. And I think this is an example of spiritual quest or development. Esther comes into the story in chapter 2 as a pretty little powerless girl. And 8 chapters later, Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, had full authority. How did that change take place? And I think that's something we need to think about when we're talking about authority of men or women in our own time. First of all, she did have beauty and personality, but she also had concern for her relatives. And she also had fear. She was frightened about taking the risk to go to her husband and work for her people. But she also had courage to take that risk. And then she used her wits and her ability as a hostess to entertain the emperor and Haman, to pull off the strategy that she developed. And her relationship with God and God's people through prayer and fasting. Now, that's not an old-fashioned thing. That is a timeless thing that people can still use in our quest for spirituality. Not only our own relationship with God, but our relationship with each other and working together to use our authority together and with the help of God. Those were quite interesting. I feel those were very interesting dynamics of how this authority could take place. There were some other scriptural women whose stories involved the use of the word authority in other Greek words, not that same tokef Hebrew word meaning positiveness. And some of these other stories were in the Apocrypha. There was Anna, who was Tobit's wife, who was unfairly told that she had no authority to eat stolen, and it wasn't stolen, food, using the word authority in a negative sense there. There was Judith, who points out to the town leaders who were so worried because they were under siege that maybe they had done something wrong, and that's why all of this was happening. And she said, "Nuts! It doesn't have anything to do with us. It's God who has the authority." And so Judith had the nerve to point out to people that it was God who was the person in charge here, the authority completely. And it was interesting that she had that position in that situation. Then there is a section in Sirach, the wisdom of Sirach, where all human beings who were formed by God from the dust were given authority over everything on earth. And this, I think, ties in with the changing role of women, because what happened to us? We're part of humanity. What happened to us that for many parts of our human history, we were not treated as part of humanity who shared that authority over all of the earth. Men, human beings, wasn't sharing that, were not sharing that authority with us. But if we have that authority, how have we, or how are we going to use that authority over everything on earth? And there again, I think that comes into today, and we have to realize what and how we're going to use this spiritual authority that has been given to us. The other question we need to ask is, do we share that authority with all human beings? Whether we're men or whether we're women, we can gripe about not receiving the shared authority, but we also have to realize, who are we leaving out and how are we sharing that authority? I'm going to skip over some of the other scriptural things that I had picked out because I'm just getting too gabby here. So I'm going to skip up into the scripture concerning Jesus of Nazareth. And this, one of the, I think, chief things about authority from Jesus was opened up by a woman. And this was a woman that some of us like to call Mother Thunder. And there are two places in Christian scripture that refer to this story about authority. One is in Matthew chapter 20, verse 25, and the other is in Mark chapter 10, verse 42. One of them does not mention, the Mark one does not mention the mother at all. And the Matthew one does not mention the names of the mother's sons. And I think that's kind of an interesting difference in the two stories, because names are important with people. Anyway, Mother Thunder had two sons who were close friends of Jesus. One day she knelt before Jesus and asked him to say that her sons would sit at his right and left in his realm. Jesus said they didn't know what they were asking, and that the privilege was not his to give. When the 10 other friends of Jesus heard about this request, they were furious. So Jesus called a meeting and said that national rulers wield full privilege and authority over folks. And here is the word authority. And in this situation, it was the Greek word katsiousiaso, and it's a word seldom used in secular Greek, only used in scriptural and religious. But whoever in this group, this is what Jesus is saying again, the national authorities like to have authority over people, but whoever in this group wants to be great or first will be your servant or your slave. Jesus went on to point out, I didn't come here to sit around and be waited on, but I came here to serve you and to use my life for many, many people. I think this is an important story because I think Jesus is contrasting here the difference between spiritual quest and secular quest for authority. And I think the issues and the possibilities for women here are very, very complicated. Is Jesus trying to bring back the balance of authority with which all humanity had been endowed back in that creation verse from Sirach? Probably not. But would the woman listener, who hadn't asked for recognition for herself, but for her sons, feel that the servant role to which she might have been accustomed was elevated or changed by using it as a passkey to greatness? Or would she feel cheated that visible authority was withheld from her as usual, even through her sons? This has definitely been an issue for feminists in society and religion. Feminists who wish to be included in roles of authority, even while realizing that these roles, as carried out presently, are tarnished with negative, and remember Esther's authority word equals positiveness, negative oppressive power procedures. A lot of feminists don't want to get into that. Many feminists wish to be included in traditionally male roles while transforming those roles. Back in 1974, when I was first ordained to the priesthood, we had a meeting about 6 months after we were ordained, and Bishop Corrigan met with us, and we were grappling with a lot of these issues about authority and about transforming the priesthood and kind of what priesthood meant. And Bishop Corrigan looked at us and he said, if you all end up being the same kind of priest that men priests have been forever, then I've wasted my time. When he said that to me, don't worry about it, I felt like somebody had hit me right in the middle of the forehead. It hurt. That wasn't really what I wanted to hear. And yet, in spite of the fact that I didn't want to hear it, those words have stuck with me for the last 15 years as a lodestar, pulling me forward or pulling me who knows where in my search for how I live out my life as an authority or as a person in leadership. And so I don't think that's a clear issue as to whether women are going to transform these authority modes or not, or what our responsibilities are, or whether it isn't everybody should take part in transforming these authority modes so that they become the Esther positive rather than the negative national authorities that Jesus wasn't too thrilled with in what he was saying. Okay, let's skip over the rest of the scriptural stuff because I am getting a little bit long-winded here. I wanted to just say that another place that people can look for feminist or feminine or female aspects of authority as we look into our spiritual quest. And remember that our spiritual quest is not just in the future, it's almost a cyclical thing where we've had dry periods in history and rich periods in history, and so we need to look back and see how these patterns are and get ideas from our past, because many of those ideas can enrich our futures together. And another place that we can look at role modeling and look at the questions that maybe are raised is in the Christian tradition. We have a tradition of people who have been recognized as having especially spiritual lives, people we call saints. And I'm just going to quickly list off a bunch of them so that you can get some ideas. We had Saint Junia, who was mentioned in Romans chapter 16, verse 7, who was notable among the apostles, probably a bishop. We had Saint Platonida, who was a monastic founder in the 3rd century. And we had Saint Olympiada, who was ordained. We had Saint Nectarius, who served on the cathedral staff in Constantinople before her death in 410. We had Saint Radegun, who was a queen and founded a monastic order and was ordained validly but irregularly before she died in 587. We had Saint Hilda, who founded a famous coeducational monastery at Whitby in the British Isles. It's interesting to note that 3 of these spiritual leaders founded communities. Are spiritual women still doing that today? successfully? What sorts of communities? What are the needs and possibilities for us? This field at this time, how will that shape our future spirituality? Might it be that we need more corporate spirituality, more cooperative spirituality? How have women fared on our spiritual quest in terms of interfaith conversations? I must admit that my experience is a little bit limited on this. I have done ecumenical work, and so I would trust that if you are interested in exploring how women have fared on the interfaith conversational level, you'll do a little bit of your own research there. But I found that in reading the final report, for instance, from the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission, women seem to be excluded from what they called the koinonia, communion of the church community, except for the one reference to the Roman Catholic Church as her and the Anglican Church as sister. Then I found that later on they said the authority of the church will be mediated through them. Through them, that means community and each of its members, and this is Christian authority. When Christians so act and speak, men perceive the authoritative word of Christ. Does it matter if women perceive while the community is bearing its responsibility toward all mankind? If women's perceptions, roles, and responsibilities are not a concern to the men who are presently assuming authority, all members of that international commission, incidentally, were men. What is the godly way for such excluded folks to proceed? What is the will of God, both for the excluders and for the excluded? You know, that's a hard question to answer. Well, God does have some surprises, even though humans can ignore those surprises sometimes. For instance, on page 84 of that final document in paragraph 8, there is some discussion of the importance of Peter and the other apostles as witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Not a word that in this document between Anglicans and Roman Catholics, there was not one word that in each of the four Gospels, the books about Jesus' life, the story of Jesus' resurrection, that women were mentioned as being the first human witnesses of Jesus' return to human life. Not a word was mentioned in that document. And it was interesting, too, that those women were performing serving roles, which Jesus had said would make you first and great, as they took spices to care for the corpse. Is that why Jesus honored them as first? But what happened to their descendant sisters in terms of inclusion and recognition down through the centuries? Why did their brothers choose to ignore God's surprise in making them, that means the first making the men the first witnesses? Why did their brothers choose to exclude them from the papacy and from the recognized ordained ministries? Or maybe choose to bury the history of their early sharing of those roles? Anyway, how can we go on from that exclusion and work together now? In 1985, the Anglican and Orthodox Christian Joint Doctrinal Commission decided that they could still talk in spite of the fact that there were problems such as the ordination of women. You know, that's how these interfaith discussions go. And then in 1972, in the Lutheran Episcopal Dialogue, they did talk about women's priestly ministry as baptizers was acknowledged, even though the Episcopal Church was not yet ordaining women to the priesthood. However, the document itself was loaded with such words as fellowship, man, men, and mankind. so women weren't totally involved in that either. Anyway, there are more ecumenical, more interfaith things sort of along the same lines. It's interesting to notice that in the Jewish-Christian dialogue documents, they were primarily concerned with language and process of working together. Women and men were neither included nor excluded. Authority and roles were not even issues. The emphasis seemed to be that both of our traditions are living and developing. And I think that's something for us all to be proud of and to rejoice in, that maybe those are the more important issues than some of the other issues that become so negative. If we can be positive as we search for the kind of spirituality that we want in the future. And so I think that we, as far as my input is concerned, I really want to just leave you with that thumbnail sketch of some of the things that have gone on in our history, the positive things and the negative things. And I think that if in our question and answer period, we can all together grapple with some of the futures and some of the ways that we can ensure that all of us can work together on forming what's going to happen in our own spirituality as individuals and in our corporate spirituality as we all try to work together and with God for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Swanson. My name is Abe Epstein. I'm president of the Ames Jewish Congregation. And I guess I'd like to welcome everyone to the third annual dialogue. And before I get any further, I think we ought to recognize the committee that put this all together for their very excellent work. I know from the Ames Jewish Congregation, Dave Gradwell and Barbara Pleasance. Who else? How about St. David's? Any of the committee here? Oh, thank you. As a layperson, I have often wondered about this disparity with all of the, having grown up in an Orthodox household and hearing of all the female heroes as well as the male heroes in our background, I often wondered why women took such a subordinate role in this religion. So again, I compliment the committee for having chosen very well. Our second speaker tonight, Devorah Jacobson, Rabbi Devorah Jacobson, is a native of Miami, Florida. She received a Bachelor of Arts from Brandeis University, attended the Hebrew Union College Institute of Religion in New York, and was ordained a rabbi in May of 1982. She also attended the Menninger Foundation on the subjects of graduate marriage, a graduate program, marriage and family therapy, and has participated in a very long list of human services in the St. Louis area, where she is associated with she's associate executive director of the B'nai B'rith Hillel Foundation, serving all of the colleges and universities in the St. Louis area. Well, I won't go through the long list of accomplishments of this person, and in the interest of time, I think I will present Rabbi Jacobson at this point.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm honored to be here and flattered to have been invited. Traditionally, before I teach, I like to start with a blessing. And given that the new month or the new moon in the Jewish calendar, which is a lunar calendar, begins this Friday and this Saturday, the month of Iyar, I'd like to begin with a blessing for the new moon. And it's also an example of new liturgy, which Jewish women are writing. So I thought that was appropriate to include. And I'll wait till everybody has a page. Also on the page that you're getting is a reading called Applesauce by Judith Plaskow. We don't have time, but I hope you'll read it on your own. It's an example of what I'll be referring to as new midrash, or new stories that women and men are writing based on the biblical text, and which reflects certain modern and, I think, feminist sensibilities. So, beginning with, on the green page, welcoming the new moon of Iyar. Then the rabbi said, "The secret of wisdom, Chokhmah, is in the name of the moon when blessed from every side." Then the moon began to wane. So, after we have inherited the moon in its fullness, we desire to inherit it in its defective state, to gain knowledge of spirits and demons inheriting the moon on every side. And whoever would like to join with me in the actual blessing, please do. Blessed is our God, creator of the heaven and the earth. You have ordained that each month the moon be renewed as a woman's body. Both are a source of strength for those who are bearing the burdens of this life, for they are the symbol of hope, that all may be reborn to new life. Baruch atah Adonai, mechadesh chodashim. Blessed is our God, who renews the months. Amen. Our topic this evening is Women and the Spiritual Quest, Issues and Possibilities. The topic itself, I suspect, may be an issue for some. Indeed, for many Jews, I suspect for most modern people, the notion of a spiritual quest is an issue, if not a problem. It's a phrase that makes us feel uneasy. As Jews, our concerns and agendas throughout this century have been highly secular. Jewish refugees had to be saved, anti-Semites had to be opposed, a Jewish state had to be reestablished and nurtured, oppressed Jews in the Soviet Union and Ethiopia and elsewhere had to be helped. We could not allow the Holocaust to be forgotten. Highly important tasks, all of these, but highly agnostic. The spiritual life, the quest for a life with God, has been peripheral to our ongoing concerns, peripheral perhaps even in our synagogues. Since the end of the 18th century, with the political emancipation of Jews from ghetto existence, most Jews have undergone a steady process of secularization. Now, at the end of the 20th century, we realize how much more modern we are than Jewish. How much we are, as one rabbi put it, a community in search of a faith. Now, 200 years after we emerge to participate in the life and the thought of the West, we feel and see signs all around us pointing to the spiritual emptiness of the West. We hear voices around us searching for the new age and the lost dimension of the spiritual. Now, 200 years after religion was assigned to its own little cubbyhole to make way for secular society, the role of religion is being reconsidered and reevaluated. As Abraham Maslow has written about the place of religion in our schools, an education which leaves untouched the entire region of transcendental thought, is an education which has almost nothing to say about the meaning of life. Within society at large, other religions in general, and Judaism to be sure, there is a call for renewal, and furthermore, a quest to redeem the spiritual. There is a movement that wants to go beyond the Judaism we learned about in Sunday school, the Judaism of reason and rationality, beyond the Judaism which was equated solely with ethics. A move is underway to explore the dimension of the non-rational, the mythic, the mystical, the experiential, to talk about faith and God, to recover that which for so long has been repressed, including the element of the feminine. And so it is within this context that I begin the discussion of women and the spiritual quest within Judaism. Because a major part of the movement of renewal of Judaism and Jewish life is concerned with and spurred on by the inclusion of the life experiences and voices of Jewish women as they go in quest of the divine. What have Jewish feminists had to say? What have been their concerns and their questions? And how have they created a theology that is both Jewish and feminist? We begin with the understanding that the major experience which many Jewish women have of Judaism is marginality. Excluded by halakha, Jewish law, from participation in the public roles of the synagogue, alienated by masculine language referring to divinity, overlooked by life cycle rituals which view women as passive or invisible, women are viewed by normative Judaism as other. In fact, a whole section of the Mishnah, the first code of Jewish law, is devoted to legislation for and about women, and it assumes a view of woman as abnormal and irregular, and therefore requiring special sanctification. Ours is a tradition created by men, interpreted by men, passed down from father to son. All the classical normative sources of Jewish theology were created by and for men. Women's voices are hard to discern, and the theological visions we have received are incomplete. From early on, women experience moments of exclusion, moments of feeling as an outsider. They are told, you don't count in a minyan, prayer quorum. You don't have to say Kaddish for your loved ones, Kaddish being the memorial prayer. And be careful lest your voice arouse men in prayer. You can't initiate a divorce, a religious divorce. And you can't serve as witnesses in a court of Jewish law. From early on, women experience a feeling of betrayal by their people, their tradition, and their God. Betty Friedan, in her writing, talks of first stage and second stage feminism. To appropriate her language, the first stage of Jewish feminism, roughly coinciding with the decade of the 70s, moved towards correcting women's marginality by asserting that women should be included where we had previously been excluded. Arguing on the grounds of simple justice, women demanded to have equal access to positions of leadership and authority. The questions of the first stage were questions of equality and equal access. Can women be rabbis? Can women be counted in a minyan? Can women read Torah? Can women say Kaddish? For the most part, these first stage questions were questions of Jewish law and tradition. All these concerns parallel the first stage of secular feminism. The ERA, equal pay for comparable work, the opening up of predominantly male professions to women. In both the Jewish and secular realms, What had been labeled male was still understood as the norm. Women wanted to be counted within the male model. While the questions and struggles of the first stage remain unfinished in both the secular and the Jewish world, we are seeing the second stage unfolding. The second stage moves beyond questions of equal access to questions of spirituality, beyond the male model to different models, and an exploration of a different way of thinking and acting. The second stage begins by asserting that women are not other, that women's experiences are Jewish experiences, even though they have been ignored by sacred texts in our history. The questions of the second stage are not, can there be women rabbis and cantors? But in what ways will women be leaders of the Spirit? What models of leadership will they adopt or create? In what ways will women in religion transform Jewish spirituality? Here, we try to better understand more about the differences between men and women. For example, we have learned from people like Carol Gilligan, in a very important book, In a Different Voice,